Can you tell us about your career journey and how you've arrived at your current role?
So I've been really lucky and had some really incredible roles. I started life at Eon on their graduate scheme and then moved into Alstom Boiler, into GE gas turbines, and then Rolls-Royce. And it was Rolls-Royce that really showed me how much I love change and transformation management. So Rolls-Royce was a manufacturing business. It was in Norway, Bergen Engines, and they wanted a business model shift from a pure manufacturing business to a project delivery business, which required a cultural shift, governance, and process changes. Having done that, I moved into telecoms, who wanted the same shift, business model shift, but in a financially distressed environment. So whilst we were still working on the upskilling the team, putting in all of the requirements for project governance, a project office, having the right IT equipment, there was also a huge amount of work to do on cash, making sure that we renegotiated contracts, we reduced liabilities, and that we looked at how do we improve on-time invoicing. My most recent role was with Brush. I was Chief Operating Officer at Brush and then moved to Managing Director of their solutions business. And they brought me on board for a similar reason. They wanted a comprehensive shift in their culture and their operations of their manufacturing business. They wanted to focus on safety and increase their safety performance, and they had a real focus on quality, and they want to improve their first time yielding quality. But being a manufacturing business and swapping to a projects business, we had to do a similar project governance, processes, and IT. But that's really shown me why I love change and why I've set myself up as a transformation consultant.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much. And what are some of the projects and power stations you've been involved in?
So when I started in the energy industry, I was as a project manager.
Mhm.
And when I worked for Eon, I worked first in their sort of centralized asset management function, where we got to look over the entire portfolio, which at the time was thermal. So it had their gas, their coal, it had some biomass, and it had CHP. But I moved on to site management, first at Enfield, and then where I was doing outage management, and then in Ratcliffe, where we did the life extension project. And actually, it was at Ratcliffe that I did my first cultural transformation project. I worked with Alstom, and they'd had the maintenance contract at Ratcliffe for more years than I care to remember, but they'd been very much driven down a really reactive maintenance route. How quickly can we get the unit back on? But as part of the life extension project and investing in the asset, we wanted to reshape that maintenance contract, working with the client, working with Eon, to become a proactive maintenance. So we went through the process of, rather than waiting for something to break down before it's fixed, actually what are the proactive interim, so sort of short and longer term maintenance strategies that we can put in place. And then my role was, how do we shape the team and the contract that we worked on that allowed us to do all of those hours as proactive maintenance? And then how do we build the team to have that cultural shift of, actually, I've done an interim inspection here, and now I'm going to schedule in to do X, Y, and Z that's been found from that maintenance interval, rather than wait for it to break and then have to go in and fix it. So there was quite a shift in what the expectations were from the team were, and that was my role, was to manage that.
Amazing. This is a bit off piece, but did you find that quite a hard conversation to have with the engineers who probably had kind of one way of working for their whole career up until that point?
Yes, yes.
I can
um,
imagine.
Do you know, it was a really interesting experience, and gosh, like a baptism of fire, because you are faced with people who have been doing their role possibly for longer than you've been alive. They know that role inside out, and that's what they've been told to do. And suddenly an outsider comes in and tells them to do something different. And the best thing I learned there was, how do you manage your stakeholders? How do you manage your team? And how do you get people enthusiastic about a change when actually they've seen so much of it? It's not interesting to them anymore.
Yeah.
It's just another flash in the pan. Whereas actually this is the one that we really wanted to embed in and become that sort of long-term solution. So working with people who on paper, I shouldn't have been working with, but actually built some really nice relationships with them in the process.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you. And what skills did you learn in the power sector that help in your current position at Change and Transformation Manager?
So without a doubt, the power sector has been instrumental into where I am today. But I think if I look back, the best thing it's taught me is how to position myself.
Hmm.
So if you think, when I first worked on a power station sort of 15 years ago was my first power station site experience. The industry at the time, it was very much about tenure. How long had you been there?
Hmm.
If you hadn't been there 20 years, 30 years, like even 40 years, then you didn't have a voice. So I had to learn how to hone my skills and have that opinion that was heard as an outsider. So I learned really not to fight the current, but I had to find another path. And project management and change management allowed me to do that. Because I've spent the rest of my career doing that, I think I've built enough of commercial acumen that I can ask the right questions in a credible environment, but always with a fresh pair of eyes. And because I've worked for all these different companies now, a real plethora of best practice that I can bring to an organization to help them manage that transformation. But I would not have learned that, and I would not learn that about myself if I hadn't have worked in the power sector.
Yeah, oh, amazing. And again, this is a little bit off piece, but I'm really just generally interested. How long does those kind of those transformations take? Do you find that people get on board in a matter of days, in a matter of weeks? Is it kind of just having to
Yeah.
chip away for a really long time with some people who have, like you say, been in the role maybe 40, 50 years?
The first thing I always do whenever I'm parachuted into an environment that I'm not familiar with is to try and talk to everybody
Yeah.
and understand from those on the ground what their current working environment is like.
Hmm.
And I compare that then with what the leadership's aspirations are of where it's going to go. So if you looked at the role that we did for Alstom,
Hmm.
the client wanted to do this really proactive maintenance. And when I sat down with there was 35 of them at the time, the maintenance team, and asked them what was their input in this, you immediately find some people get it.
Yeah.
And want to do it because actually they really want to do a good job, and they
Yeah.
don't like the fact that they are having to put a sticking plaster on that piece of asset time and time again.
Yeah.
They want the time and the opportunity to do a good job. Those people are your champions, and they are the people that very, very quickly you identify and you can work with them, and they'll become the champion for you to work with in terms of, right, this is what I think the management vision is going to be, this is how we're going to move it forward. But actually they're the champion on behalf of their colleagues as well, because if they're the right people and they're respected within the team, then they can often work with some of the late adopters to try and
Yeah.
get them on board as well.
So almost like a peer management within the structure.
Yeah. Yes, you're trying to find people who can champion what you're trying to do at all different levels, and they'll often relate to their peers in a different way, won't they?
Of course.
They'll be able to give the real life examples that say, hey, do you know how frustrated we were when this happened? That won't happen anymore, because they've got the history and you don't have that. So
Yeah.
those champions are the people that you spend a lot of time working with.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. And what makes transformation work different from traditional leadership roles?
Well, I think, as we've just said, it is about driving significant change in a really short period.
Hmm.
So traditional leadership is often there'll be transformation as part of your role, or you'll be looking at continuous improvement over time. But transformation is making a really fundamental shift in the business in a very short period of time. So it might be that you want to change your business model. You want to go from being a manufacturing business to a projects business. And you want to do that and put the governance in or change the operations. But it has to be high impact and short timeframes. And for somebody who's in change, then that adaptability as we've said, really strong stakeholder management and a relentless focus on that outcome is really important. And I think if I give you an example,
Yeah.
and I've just been working in manufacturing, that transformation was 10 months.
Okay.
And that was a complete change in people and process within that 10 months. So we had to change. So the leadership structure changed, the way that the customer contracts were written and implemented was changed, how we addressed change management within contracts had to be changed.
Mm-hmm.
We had quality management, new tooling, and that drive for accuracy on first time yield. But that focus really on safety, then quality, and then profitability managed that transformation within that 10 months. So taking something from loss making to profitability in such a short period of time.
Yeah. And do you get involved for that whole 10-month period? Do you kind of come in before you, ideally, I appreciate you probably get pulled in at different points, but at the point they want to make the change and then see it out to conclusion?
That's definitely my preferred way of doing it. Yeah, that actually I'm in before they've really started the process, or they've started it but it hasn't really got teeth yet, because then I get to work from day one defining what that vision looks like and what that implementation plan looks like, and going back to starting to speak to the team, understanding who the champions are, and putting together that very structured process that says, this is where you currently are, this is what the data is telling you where you are, and this is where we want to get to and how we're going to do it.
And what do you think the biggest mistakes companies can make when approaching transformation?
So the biggest mistakes I've seen probably fall into a couple of different pockets. So there's underestimating sort of people and cultural shift. And if we look at sort of the ultimate example, people had been doing that for a really long period of time. They've been doing it for 20, 30 years. So the cultural shift is not something that happens overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And underestimating how long that's going to take, depending on how embedded it is something that people really can underestimate and make a mistake on. Any transformation has to have a really clear sponsorship from the board, from the exec, from the CEO. It has to have teeth, and it has to have resources associated with it, because all that happens otherwise is that it drags, it stops being transformation because it loses momentum. And if people are doing it alongside their day jobs, short-term sort of reactive fires always take priority. And then because it's taken so long, so the goalposts start to shift and people say, well, we'll do this and we'll do this as well. So you have to have real clear sponsorship and resources for that fixed period to say, this is the transformation we're going to go through. And then I think the last one is probably the saddest one, and people focus on it for a really short period of time and they cut a lot of costs, but then actually it's not sustainable. So they can make a really good sort of flash in the pan impact in their profitability, but because it was unsustainable, that all that happens afterwards is that costs just sort of start creeping back up again. So it's important to me to work with leadership teams and work with businesses where we are making realistic transformation improvements that can be embedded into the business and set up the governance and the process and the structures, that becomes the new way of working, as opposed to just a short term, as I say, flash in the pan.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how do you measure the success of a transformation initiative?
So depending on what you're wanting to change, there's qualitative and quantitative measures. So often transformation is driven by financial metrics. So you're wanting a growth in EBITDA, you're wanting cash flow improvements, you're wanting profitability. And underneath that, there's definitely operational efficiencies. So how do we do things on time? How do we improve quality? And what's the governance maturity and impact of that? Then there's, how we measuring this culturally.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely want to put KPIs around what's the employee engagement like. It's important that the leadership team have the capability. And one of the key measures for me is, are the leadership team sort of on board with this, but then also, are they then driving their own change independently? And that feeds into trying to understand, trying to put a metric around, is this change still in place 12 months, 24 months, 36 months later? And that cultural impact driving sustainability of the process.
And how do you manage resistance to change?
When I first started out in transformation, you hear this old people, change always comes from fear, and it's always job loss or failure and uncertainty. And I think people miss sort of a fourth factor in that, and actually that there's been too much change in the past.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a new leadership team comes in, everybody wants to change something to make their mark. This is and people can just be jaded by it. So the key is really transparency. So why are we making this change? What will it mean? And why is this time different? And by engaging with people and teams early, I always ask their opinion on it.
Mm-hmm.
So change for me can't be just a top-down push. Yeah. It really has to be bottoms up as well, because that's how you get people engaged. So I try and sort of listen to the current process. I ask them to map out the current process. And from the people who are doing it day to day, what does work and what doesn't work? And really listening to them helps me go back to the leadership team and agree what the transformation needs to be, because we can encompass as much of the frustrations that everybody on the ground is feeling. And then you get a great change from the leadership perspective, because you've done that business model change or you've done that operational change. But actually, by doing that, you've addressed some of the real pinch points and bugbears of the team. And so their engagement and adoption becomes much smoother.
When you're working with these businesses and putting in these changes, you're obviously speaking to the people on the ground, but then does the actual change, and whether that's a change in process or whatever it might be, come from them directly to the people on the ground? Does that come from you, or does it vary case by case?
It definitely varies case by case, but actually I think it's probably an amalgamation of all three.
Yeah.
So the leadership team will have a concept that they are driving. And ultimately, it's the leadership team that engages me. So there has to be that want and that need at that level to make change. But if I look at wanting to increase safety, you are actually wanting to improve your safety metrics,
Mm-hmm.
for example, then the safety team, the leadership team might say, we have a KPI that we're trying to move to, and we want our TRIF, like our total injury rate frequency, to be at a certain level. But that doesn't happen just talking to the leadership team. You really have to go into the teams on the ground to say, well, what's the root cause of why the incidents are currently happening? Is it education? Is it tooling? Is it the environment that you're working in? So between the leadership team's concept and working with the teams on the ground in terms of what are some of the movements that we need to make, I can create a process. I can create a structure of what needs to happen for the leadership team to get to the metric they want by working with the teams on the ground. And it might be that it creates some sort of subgroups of work.
Mm-hmm.
So we have really key deliverables within this big change that need to happen, and they're driven by some of the teams on the ground. But without a doubt, you have to engage that whole breadth of the hierarchy to be able to create a sustained change. Because all I'm trying to do really is spark people's interest, aren't we? And actually,
Exactly.
we've got something that we need to change and we don't know how to do it, so we'll call somebody in. And I think that's what we're trying to get across here, is that there are people who specialize in this, because it's not everybody's skill set. You can be the best leader in the world and manage your team brilliantly as a business as usual manager, and something fundamental comes along and it's just a different skill set.
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, I wouldn't try and do the heating engineering role in this house. The whole heating needs to be in. You'd bring in a specialist, and I think that's what we're trying to show here, is that there are specialists out there that can help, and you don't have to have them in your team the full time to do it. They come in, they deliver, and they leave.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I think it was really interesting seeing that when you answer the question about the mistakes that people make, because a lot of that is fundamentally comes down to not having someone whose priority it is. So
Yeah.
whether that's how long it is, if it hit and then it kind of falls off the wayside, which obviously is going to happen when, like you say, you're firefighting and you've got your day job to do. So I'll move on to those questions now. What advice would you give to your younger self or someone else who is starting out in the engineering sector?
I think it's a really, really exciting time to join the industry. If you look at some of the challenges with this grid modernisation and distribution, so net zero we're still talking a lot about, and this emerging impact of AI, these are all real cutting edge changes that need to happen in the engineering sector. And they'll all need brand new ways of thinking. So anybody put off previously by that, this is the way we do things, we've always done it this way philosophy, have the opportunity to come in at a time when their different way of thinking is really going to be important. So my advice would be to join the industry. Ask as many questions as you can. Learn about not just your job, but what the whole business does and how it interacts with the entire industry. And through that network of people that you will meet when you're asking those questions, then they're going to become really important people to you. If I look now, 20 odd years after I joined the industry, I've decided to become self-employed and I wanted advice. The first people I reached out to were those people that I met when I joined the industry 20 years ago. So, ask questions, be curious, and build a network.
Amazing. And what challenges have you or other women faced working in male-dominated industry?
So even this week, believe it or not, I've been told, oh, there aren't many women in your field. And that's really disappointing. And that's whether that's power industries or operations or in manufacturing or like me, kind of in change management. There just aren't enough women. There aren't that many. But women bring a complete different view to how things can be done. And that sort of diversity of thought we're seeing more and more now on leadership teams and in change management teams. And it can only add and improve the process by having different viewpoints. So I think the hardest challenge I've had is that learning to be credible when you think differently. So especially in industry, and as we said before, it loves that phrase, we've always done things this way, has been really challenging to be a different thought process and sort of an outsider in the way that you think. But that challenge it has been overcome. There are a lot more women in leadership now, and I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it fits really nicely with the last question, where it's just people thinking differently, and
Yeah.
every different kind of person is going to bring their own experiences, and to negate half the population from the decisions is just taking away so many different viewpoints. And I think you're right there. I think it is moving in the right direction. We obviously mainly do with engineering sector rather than the other ones that you mentioned that are also lacking females a lot of the time. But even in the couple of years, 3 years I've been here, I've noticed that change. So I'm hoping it continues in the right direction.
Yeah, and I met one of the CEOs at National Grid, and I think she said something brilliant. She said, our workforce should represent our customer base. And that's really
100%.
important. If your customer base is very diverse, then if you want to have a business and a leadership team within that business that understands what your customers want, you need representation from from the entire population.
100%. And how do you think we can encourage more girls and women to consider careers in STEM, particularly in the power sector?
So this is something I'm really interested in and read up about a lot. If you look at the IET, they quote that there's 1 million women in STEM roles now, which is nearly 30% of the workforce, which is a huge amount more than when I started, which is very, very positive. But it still doesn't represent the number of people who do STEMs at GCSE. So GCSE is actually 50-50, more or less, male, females who study STEM related topics. But we just don't seem to have the women that take that interest at education level into full-time employment. And if you look at sort of the IET survey and it asks people about STEM roles, the people in the industry talk really positively about the changes that are made, as do I, as do you. So it has made significant steps towards diversity, and we should celebrate that. But the people on the outside just don't seem to be seeing it. So the more visible women and minority roles can be in leadership as technical experts, as technicians, will just help us normalize it as a career path to the point where at some point people won't even think that it is a different thing to do.
I agree on absolutely every word of that. I think it's so much about representation, and people, teenagers, and like you say, not just women, but also other minority groups, when they're making decisions of what degrees they're going to do and what careers they're going to pursue, seeing people like them in those roles just means that it's an option.
And speaking to somebody else yesterday, because I've been on the phone a lot, speaking to someone else yesterday, she now works with the National Apprenticeship Boards. And one of the things she was talking about was there is a requirement, there's a social mobility element around even just learning to drive. And so apprenticeships that say you must be able to drive, whilst they're not gender specific, but they do prioritise people who are in wealthier areas who can afford to learn lessons and tests and things like that. So the National Apprenticeship Boards now are looking at putting in sort of bursaries in sort of lesser economic areas that allow people to go into apprenticeship schemes and then have bursaries to learn to drive.
What a good idea.
And I was absolutely bowled over. I thought that's a brilliant idea, because you are just trying to level the playing field for everybody. So whatever background you come from, you have the same opportunity. So whether you're male or minority or socially mobile, you've got the same opportunities to be sort of capable and credible in this business.
And I think for power stations, that's so relevant because so many of them are out in the sticks and you can't get to on public transport. So it would be perfect for that kind of those specific roles as well.
Yes.
Amazing. Thank you so much.